The resurrection is a central tenet of Christianity, which has been defended through the ages by the apostles, as read in the Bible, by the early Christians, by Christians today, and by many apologists. Now, the most popular of the defenses put up for the resurrection are what we call the five minimal facts. Apologists say these facts cannot be explained as well in any other way than that Jesus must have risen from the dead as described in the Bible. I cannot claim to know what happened on the first Easter morning. But as an atheist, naturally I wouldn't ascribe to claims of a resurrection as described in the Bible, of a supernatural event as such. However, I also don't want to say that it's impossible that the resurrection happened exactly as described in the Bible, or that I wouldn't accept the resurrection just because a supernatural event could not be a historical explanation for what happened on the first Easter morning. No, I think it is only right to instead logically analyze the data in front of me and see how I can interpret the data. If it leads me to a supernatural conclusion in ways I cannot logically argue against, then I would have to acknowledge that as truth. Hello, welcome to Faith in Logic. I'm Tan Naoka. Here we try to approach historical and theological issues using a purely philosophical analysis. The minimal facts that I mentioned earlier often vary depending on who is putting them forward. For this video and this presentation, I will be focusing on the facts by William Lane Craig. So these 5 facts are: 1. Jesus died and was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. 2. Women went to the tomb and found it empty. 3. His followers experienced Jesus alive after death. 4. The apostles came to sincerely believe that Jesus had risen from the dead, despite Jewish theology not expecting any such thing. And 5. They were prepared to die and to defend this belief, which also led to the origin and rapid rise of the Christian faith. Now, many explanations have been put forward to explain these facts, but none have seemed to convincingly work. I think that is because any such explanation would first have accepted these facts to be indeed facts. So if there is some error in that first declaration or that first acceptance, the explanation would clearly not work, as these facts are set up to justify the resurrection as described in the Bible. I'll just use the term biblical resurrection from here on in, to justify that biblical resurrection as the only worthy explanation. So my first approach would be to interrogate these facts, just to ensure they are indeed facts. Dr. Bart Ehrman did something like this when he discounted the first of these facts, or a half of it, by saying that we take it for granted that Jesus was buried at all. He says the records show that the Romans always left the victims of crucifixion on the cross. However, not only are there counterclaims to this argument using historical records to show that there were cases when exceptions were made, I find it hard to reconcile Bart's argument with the second fact, which is the fact that women went to the tomb. Now, not to labor the point that I'm trying to make, I will point to an earlier video I made called "The Evidence for Jesus in the Gospels," or something like that. Now, in that video, I interrogate all the seeming traditions that are common to all 4 Gospels, and I go through all of them to identify the one tradition that I, as an atheist, would have no reason to doubt. Remember, I'm speaking as an atheist, not a Christian. In that video, I show that the women going to the tomb is the one piece of evidence that appears consistent and most logically, historically true as a fact of Jesus' earthly existence. And that's to me as an atheist. Therefore, as I say it, my explanation or any explanation of these 5 minimal facts and my interpretation of what happened on the first Easter morning would have to deal with the women going to the tomb. it would have to deal and address that point decisively, explain that point, for it to have a good chance of holding up logically. This is the only fact that really matters to me among all the others. And that is what this video is about. So let's look at what the Gospels say. Matthew 28 says, the women went to the tomb, and an angel came after an earthquake and rolled away the stone, terrifying the guards. It wasn't clear if the women witnessed this or not. Luke 24 says, the women went to the tomb with spices, and they found the stone rolled away. So they did not witness that angelic event, according to Luke. John chapter 20 says, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb on her own and found the stone rolled away. Now, looking at these three narratives, I would wonder that the women got up early in the morning with a mission in mind and just happened to find the stone rolled away. Did they expect this would be the case? And if not, why did they go to the tomb then? Whatever for. Then we read the Gospel of Mark, which was the first of these Gospels to be written. And we see that in Mark 16, the writer had actually addressed this point. Mark writes that three women went very early in the morning, just after sunrise, to anoint the body of Jesus. Now, on their way, they asked themselves this crucial question: who was going to roll away the stone? Who will help us roll away the stone? Mark goes on to admit that the stone was very large. This right here, the way I look at it, tells me something, that there must have been some expectation in the mind of the women in respect of that stone. And this expectation is one that I have to unpack for my own understanding of the biblical resurrection event. The questions I have to first ask are, so the three women knew there would be an insurmountable barrier in their way when they got to the tomb, and yet they carried on their journey. What were they hoping would happen? As a matter of fact, scholars have put forward suggestions to explain the women's behavior. The three most common ones are: 1. The women did not know much about the stone size and did not know if they could move it themselves or not. 2nd, the women expected to find help from other people, e.g. the caretakers or workers or guards. And thirdly, the women were driven by a psychological trigger, which is their grief and their love for Jesus, so much so they had not stopped to think about this problem. They just rushed to the tomb as soon as they could to anoint the body. In their minds, they wanted to get there first and deal with the problem later. All well and good, but the first explanation I can rule out. It does not work. 1, these women were familiar with Jewish burial customs, and they would have had an idea of the average stone size used to seal a tomb. The women actually made it clear that they had this idea, they had this information, because they asked the question, who will help us roll away the stone? They must have already known that they were very likely did not have the capability to do this on their own. Now, the second and third explanations are really the same thing. Whatever psychological driver was motivating the women, the only recourse they would have had on getting to the tomb would have been to seek the help of other people. So it brings us to the crux of the matter now. What brings me to the crux of the matter here, which is, and the question I'll have to ask is, who are these other people? Well, the Bible tells us that the caretaker or the gardener is one option, as we see in John's Gospel. Then we have the guards in Matthew's Gospel. And finally, from common sense, we would say, well, anyone else or random others. This leads me to conclude, therefore, that the women proceeded to the tomb, despite their worry about the stone sealing the tomb, because they either hoped or expected to find other people to help them, whether it be caretaker or guards or random others. The next question then would be, did the women go to the tomb merely hoping they would find other people to help, or were they actually expecting to find other people to help? Well, of the three groups presented as options for help in the Bible, only the guards could have been there by design or assignment. So if the women had an expectation of any group to be there, it would have been the guards because the guards were the only ones who could have been there by design. The caretaker or random others would have been there only voluntarily on their own business. So the women meeting either of these people, the caretaker or random others, on that morning would have been by chance, largely. However, if the women were simply hoping to find anyone to help, then the guards would also fall in that category alongside the caretaker and random others. So which is it? Did the women simply hope to find anyone to help, or did they expect to find someone, in which will in this case be soldiers, to help? Well, for the hope option, a third of the groups that could have helped the women were guards. So the women were by 33% likelihood hoping to find guards there. With the expectation option, however, the women were definitely expecting to find guards there. It could only have been guards. So that's 100% likelihood or certainty. So simply going by mathematical probability by a factor of 133% out of 200%, or by 133% to 67%, option B is clearly the higher likelihood scenario. This tells me that the women's behavior is historically way more likely due to them expecting to find guards at the tomb or the site where the body had been laid than they were expecting to find anyone else or any random person. So now this leads me to my alternative explanation for the women's behavior. The explanation is that the women didn't turn back because they knew that access to Jesus' body was not in their control or in the control of anyone they knew. Jesus' body was probably in the control of authority figures, guards, whether they be Roman or otherwise. Jesus had been killed as a criminal along with other criminals, and the authorities had charge of the bodies, and the authorities were monitoring how the bodies were disposed of. Matthew clearly said there were guards at the tomb or where the bodies had been put. Now, of course, this is where Christians and I would part ways. The Christian can accept that the women were expecting to find guards at the tomb, but for them, understandably, a miracle still occurred. An angel appeared or some supernatural event occurred, and the guards were terrified and the guards ran away. Fine. I don't have enough in the data to lead me to that conclusion, and I'm going by the biblical data here. All I have is that the women who were expecting to find guards at the tomb or where the bodies had been laid or the bodies had been laid met male figures, spiritual beings who confirmed that Jesus was not there. I interpret this to mean the guards telling the women that the body was not there, or the body was missing, or they could not account for the body. Of course, this would have caused the women distress, as we see in the Gospels, and they ran back to tell the followers this distressing news. In John's Gospel, Mary was so distressed, she pleaded with the guards, saying, "Tell me where you have put him, and I will go and carry him. I'll go and get him." Which, as you can imagine, she wouldn't have been able to do because Jesus was a full-grown man. But she was so distressed, she was ready to do anything. Now, then the followers of Jesus who had high expectations of him, had visions of him later on, and put it together with his body missing or unaccounted for, they came to the belief then that he had indeed risen from the dead. It was not like the body was accessible to falsify that belief, especially if there was no explanation why his body was moved or missing, or why the soldiers or the guards could not account for his missing body. So my interpretation of the alleged resurrection event does not and cannot deny the fact that women went to the tomb, which for me is a logically deduced piece of evidence for Jesus' existence, and the one fact of these five minimal facts I can accept to be historically true without a shadow of a doubt. I can also accept that the tomb or the place where his body had been put was indeed empty, but because it had been moved by authority figures who could not or would not produce it to his followers, and not because of some supernatural event. And I derive my interpretation by staying true to the gospel narratives without, of course, accepting the obviously supernatural claims, because I don't see how the data points to that. As always, it's faith and logic. Thanks for watching.